Thank you all for hanging in there and joining us for this last panel. I promise it will be interesting and fascinating in many different ways. What we're going to focus on here a bit is really the organizations themselves, how they've evolved, how they're spreading, how they're operating. Not just in Mexico, as important as that is, and we've got David Shirk here to help us decipher that in Mexico, but also to look at Central America, which is increasingly becoming an important player or location for the organized crime groups to operate. And then also, as I said at the beginning, to look at distribution networks in the United States, and in particular this phenomenon, growing phenomenon of black tar heroin being trafficked from Mexico into the eastern United States. It's spread into the eastern United States. I think I'm going to follow here the order on the agenda and start with Stephen Dudley. Stephen Dudley is a longtime journalist who was a Miami Herald correspondent in Colombia and the Andes region for many years. I'm not sure how many, but I've known him over the years for his fine work and research there. He's also traveled extensively throughout Central America and Mexico, and we were happy when he agreed to help us out to try to get a broad picture of what's happening in Central America, particularly the Northern Triangle. We don't mean to imply by that the other countries aren't facing real challenges in terms of organized crime, but we thought it was worth it to narrow down on the countries of the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras in particular. And we asked him to look at two things. One, what is the nature of organized crime already in those countries, because we understand that they have had their own sort of domestic organized crime, but also what the increasing role of the Mexican groups has been in Central America. So I think you will find his presentation and his papers, chapter in the book, very interesting. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you very much to the Wilson Center as well. It was definitely an honor to participate in this project. I think it turned out really great. Incredible breadth and depth, really, on all the papers. I wrote the paper, obviously, about drug trafficking in Central America. To do this, I traveled to 3 Central American countries, the 3 in the Northern Triangle: Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras. I talked to a wide range of people to do this project. I talked to everyone from firemen to Drug Enforcement Administration officials, and really kind of just to develop a wide, sort of broad picture of the situation, but also trying to hone in on a couple things that we can talk a little bit about. One is the notion of a little bit of the fighting between some of the Mexican cartels that is going on in the region now. And the other is looking a little bit more closely at the gang issue and how closely the gangs are related or not related to these organized criminals and their groups. Why are we talking about this? Well, really because, if you look at the history, there was a shift in the 1980s after crackdown in mostly the Caribbean. In Miami, which is the major corridors for drugs entering into the United States. The United States cracked down on that significantly, so there was a shift. This shift took place over a period of many years, and really laid the groundwork for what we're seeing today. The big thing that happened in the early 2000s, which really kind of helped sort of finalize the process, was the sort of dissolution of the last 2 major cartels in Colombia, Norte Valle Cartel and the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, which is, roughly call it a cartel, but it's a large federation of paramilitary groups that really formed the backbone of the drug trafficking operations in Colombia for a very long time. The results of this in Central America are just an incredible amount of violence. The Northern Triangle is considered the most violent place in the world that is not at war, and instability. There is obviously major signs of instability. I suppose a very interesting way for you to track that and look at that would be to look at the case that is being tried right now in a Guatemalan court, which has to do with several Central American parliamentarian representatives who were killed in 2007. Might be an interesting case just to dig in a little bit about how this all works. How does it work? Well, the area is a transit area. Central America basically operates as just sort of a region in which they can move the product through or use it as a depot. The areas, the countries really where you see most of this traffic are Honduras and Guatemala, although it's very hard to measure given the lack of reliable statistics and uneven law enforcement. These countries also serve as hideouts. They serve as neutral meeting areas, and they have other functions beyond just being strict transit areas. The drugs themselves move by every possible way you can imagine. They move by land, they move by sea, they move by air. The traffickers themselves depend on having wide open spaces. They depend on using all kinds of the infrastructure that exists, whether it's an economic infrastructure or whether it's a law enforcement infrastructure. They will use every possible means at their disposal. For example, taking advantage of the fact that there is a very large fishing industry right off the coast of Honduras and Nicaragua. So they will transit drugs to these boats. These boats will transit drugs to other boats, or these fishing vessels can be used as depots where they can fuel up because there's not any restrictions on how much gasoline a fishing vessel can have on it, so it's very hard to sort of keep an eye on those sorts of things. So they do all of these things. The local and international drug authorities, I have a map up there. This actually came from Honduran police intelligence. So it doesn't reflect actually what is the biggest route according to local and international drug authorities, which is actually the Pacific Ocean side. This will give you a very good idea of how the Hondurans look at it and what they're seeing from their perspective. The three different routes. You can see in blue, you can see the sea route, you can see the air route in yellow, and you can see the land route in red. So who's involved? The major players are from Colombia and Mexico still, although as you guys have already heard, Mexico appears to have a little bit more muscle these days, maybe a lot more muscle, depending upon what country you're talking about. Really, it seems to run from north to south. The Colombians still seem to have a lot more presence in Panama, whereas the farther north you go, the more presence you have with Mexican groups. This is changing rapidly, and as Doug Farah pointed out over and over again, we are constantly 2 steps behind. So we pick up on these things, we talk to people, and people talk about them. They're difficult to measure. Maybe we could go and we could look at maybe prison statistics and find out how many Mexicans are in prison, things like that, but really all of that falls short. So a lot of this ends up being anecdotal, but it ends up being relevant when you go to the ground. On the ground level, the guys who are working with these large Mexican and Colombian groups are what the locals term as transportistas. They're the transporters. These transporters vary in size. They vary in sophistication. Most of them got their start working in contraband already. So whether they were moving illegal dairy products, for example, was one of the major groups, is headed by a guy who used to move milk and cheese across the Fonseca Gulf from Honduras to El Salvador during the war, take advantage of some of the price differences. You know, these guys are very savvy businessmen, and their experience in moving illicit product often goes way back. There's another group in Honduras that was involved mostly as car thieves, and as a lot of you probably know, being a car thief is a pretty good entryway. We know that Pablo Escobar was also a car thief. So this gives them a lot of experience in both stealing, in this case, and trading in illicit goods. While they are working with these organizations, what's hard to pinpoint exactly is whether or not they're beholden to any one of them. You know, it appears as if they're not. It appears as if they're freelancers still, that they don't serve one particular master. But again, it's hard to discern that, and it's hard to know whether or not that's important. It appears to become more and more important, especially when you get an increasing number of them in a particular country. Then the larger organizations start to demand a bit more loyalty, and then you might start to find some violence of the type that we've seen in Guatemala, especially over the last few years, and targeting of the sort of high-level members of these transport organizations. I'm referring specifically to a case in Guatemala in 2008 when the Zetas, the Mexican group, supposedly entered in. Not clear whether or not it was at the behest or not of the other large transport organizations, but that the Zetas came in and that they assassinated Juancho Leon, who was the top member of a large transportista organization in Guatemala. Okay. The other players that we should mention, that we should not forget, are police. You know, and just to give you an example and to run through these quickly, in Guatemala, the police are involved in various ways. In Guatemala, for instance, they can be both the guys who are stealing drugs that are coming through the country, and they have a name for that in Guatemala. They call it tumbes. So they say los tumbes, you know, and they're referring to most of the time police organizations or other drug trafficking organizations that steal drugs that are traveling through the area. Or they can be part of the operations themselves. They can be part of the logistics operations, or they can be the people who are making sure that the drugs are able to be transported through. The last player I really want to mention here are the gangs. There has been so much talk about gangs. I think to a certain extent I feel like it's overblown, and that the notion of a singular gang structure, a hierarchical structure that is sort of operating out of a country like El Salvador, I think is exaggerated. And I think that their participation in the organized criminal structures is limited still. I think that it's growing, but I think that it's limited. There have allegedly been meetings between members of the probably most well-known gang possibly in the world, the MS-13, and the Zetas, the drug gang, the drug organization from Mexico. There are indications that they've found that there has been weaponry that has been passed from the Zetas into the hands of the Salvadoran gang, in particular M16s, which is kind of the favorite assault rifle of the Zetas, and M67 grenades. And the Zetas do appear to be using the gangs for very specific tasks, whether to use them as hitmen, whether to use them as possibly storage or doing some activity to do with transport. But it does appear to me, and this is I was there in January, February. These things are very fluid. They can change very quickly. It does appear to me that the gangs still lack a certain amount of discipline that a group like the Zetas would want to have if they were going to integrate them into their structure. I'll give you an example. In El Salvador, authorities say that the gangs kill close to 80% of the people that they kidnap. And that, to me, illustrates, one, that they don't have the infrastructure to handle the victims, and that, two, that they don't understand business. That killing kidnap people, the people that you kidnap, it's going to lessen your ability to gain the ransom in the future, because people are going to understand if one of their relatives is kidnapped, the most likely result is that they're going to die, regardless of whether or not you pay. So this just tells me that in general terms, they don't have the discipline or the infrastructure to be integrated into these groups. Now, there are cases in which there appear to be a greater and greater alliance between specific leaders of the MS-13 and the Zetas, in particular in El Salvador and Guatemala. But in general terms, I would say this sort of integration of the two structures is not there yet. Just real quickly, the impact, we've gone over and over this. Obviously, we've got corruption and instability. Doug Farah touched on something which is super important and which hits countries like these countries in Central America much more than it hits countries like Mexico, which is the increasing tendency to pay off your local operatives in product. And the result of that, which he didn't touch on, is a skyrocketing amount of consumption. And this is fueling an incredible amount of instability on the most micro level. And this is really interesting because it's really kind of one of these things I think that gets ignored, and something that really needs to be pointed out, which is that Latin America can no longer so easily point the finger north and say they are the consumers, that's where the problem is. Increasingly, these governments, and at an increasingly, it really starts at the local level, they're having to look in the mirror and say, we are also consumers ourselves. What is the result of this? And the result is an incredible amount of violence. I would argue that most of the violence that you see in these areas has to do with the battle control over these specific drug points, over the areas of narcomenudeo, is what they call it. And that high level of violence is as high as it gets. Just real quick, Eric, I know you are the czar of time. So I just want to say that just a couple conclusions. One is just looking at the violence level themselves. What you notice is that, again, you forget, and this really tells a story here, and I'm sorry you can't see it that well, but this is a map of Honduras, and what this illustrates is the number of the incidence of homicides in those particular areas. The more red it is, the more homicides they have. And if you follow drug trafficking trends, what you know is that those areas are exactly the areas that the drugs are being trafficked. That whole northern coast area. And so you just cannot ignore this sort of direct correlation. And a lot of this violence, again, has to go to the battle over the narcomenudeo. The thing that what you notice being down there, and there's a lot of talk about the sort of Merida initiative, et cetera, is that there is just, my first conclusion is there is just not enough money you can send down and help that you can send down to these countries right now. The situation is critical. I would say that it is several paces further along the continuum of a quote-unquote failed state, and talking specifically about Guatemala and Honduras, than Mexico is. And yet, we do not hear much about it. There is not much talk about it in Washington. How are we going to not only figure out how much money and assistance we're going to give them, but how are we going to integrate all these plans? The second thing that you notice is that they, and this is the last conclusion, Eric, I'm sorry, that these countries are facing mixed messages, I would call them. You have a situation where they have been encouraged over the last 10 years, 15 years to integrate themselves and have free trade zones. And all of this is good. All of this is positive. They want to encourage trade amongst these nations. But if you think about it, the more infrastructure, the less centralized control, and the unfettered borders that you are encouraging by having these free trade zones are exactly the type of things that these drug trafficking organizations need to operate. So you as a local government are being told that you need to create these free trade zones, which are great, economically great. But at the same time, you're told that you have to control these borders and that you have to stop the movement of drugs north, the movement of migrants north, the movement of bulk cash south, the movement of weapons south. So they're facing mixed messages. So we need to get on point here. There has to be a point at which people start to think about not just how can we help them fighting drugs, but how can we integrate all these different policies? And that would be my conclusion. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Steve. I'll take it out of your time to answer questions at the end. So, I forgot to mention that Steve is no longer with the Miami Herald. I might have left that impression, but is with Insight, co-director of a non-governmental organization looking at organized crime in the Americas. Let's turn now quickly to David Shirk. You've met him already. Has been a partner in, well, that's not a poor choice of words. I was going to say partner in crime, but partner in this endeavor. David Shirk, director of the Transborder Institute at the University of San Diego. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Eric. I'm going to do probably something that Eric will hate me for. I'm going to very quickly swap out my presentation here. I had prepared something specifically on judicial reform on the plane, and then I realized that I'm actually talking about a broader topic. So please bear with me. But I want to reiterate what a fantastic collaboration this has been, and I don't think that you will find anywhere a better collection, a more timely collection of work on these topics, and the breadth and geographic reach of this program of the material is quite impressive. And I really enjoyed Stephen's piece in particular. I'm going to talk. Oops, actually, let me escape here. One quick second. I'm going to talk about, I thought I was going to talk about police reform. Talk about the, all right, give me 1 second. I'm supposed to talk about drug violence, but I now see that I have judicial reform. But I'll give you a very quick overview of what Luis Astorga and I talk about in our paper, and then move to talk about some of the criminal procedural changes. I think the number one finding that Luis and I came up with, looking at the evolution of drug trafficking organizations over roughly the last 10 years, with some larger contextual consideration of what happened over the last, say, 20 or 30 years, is a gradual process of evolution, or really devolution, of drug trafficking organizations in Mexico. Starting in the 1980s, you had a highly centralized network, not necessarily hierarchical, but a well-coordinated umbrella for the organization of drug trafficking throughout Mexico. Primarily two large organizations. One, the Gulf Cartel, a long-standing organization with ties dating back to the Prohibition era for smuggling into the United States, and two, the sort of Sinaloa-based or originating organizations that stretched from Guadalajara to Juarez to Tijuana, and that all basically operated as one big happy familia. That network began to break down starting in 1989 with the capture of Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, and the subsequent splintering of the Sinaloa sort of empire into, or what was then called the Guadalajara Cartel, into four major competing organizations, constituted a new generation of drug traffickers in Mexico, a generation that was less centrally coordinated with the Mexican government at high levels and had their own little fiefdoms scattered geographically throughout the country. Whether that was a prearranged or sort of preconceptualized understanding of what these organizations wanted to do in the aftermath of Don Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo's reign as the top drug trafficker in Mexico, or whether it was accidental, in other words, whether this was something they negotiated or whether it was a de facto result that happened after his capture, after his arrest, is kind of irrelevant. What we see, starting in the early 90s and stretching throughout the course of the 90s, is an intense competition between these four organizations, the Sinaloa Cartel, and we avoid the term cartel because for a number of reasons it is not the best possible description of these organizations, but really there is no useful definition, right? They're not just drug trafficking organizations, they're multi-dimensional illicit corporations, but that's too long to put into a soundbite. So we call them drug trafficking organizations, DTOs for short. But you had the Sinaloa DTO, based primarily in Sinaloa, but with operations elsewhere in the country. The Juarez DTO, based in Juarez with connections back backward linkages through Mexico. The Tijuana Cartel, or DTO, and the Gulf Cartel, which sort of lasted into the second generation. Starting sometime after 2000, after the Fox administration took down major leaders in both the Tijuana Cartel and the Gulf Cartel, we saw an increased fractionalization of the cartels, a sort of third generation. And what's noticeable at each stage in this evolution is the intensification of violence among the cartels. We see in this third generation, new groups emerging like El Milenio Cartel in central Mexico, the La Familia organization, and even splinter organizations that break away from their larger network, such as the El Teo Garcia Cimentel organization in Tijuana, a guy that started out as a low-level trafficker in the Arellano Felix organization, worked his way up in the organization to the point where he felt he was capable of challenging a substantially weakened Arellano Felix organization in Tijuana. For example, the Zetas, who were newly incorporated into the Gulf Cartel under Ociel Cardenas, and eventually, recently in the last year, broke away from the Gulf Cartel, probably because in some way Ociel Cardenas turned on them once he was indicted. Again, what's noticeable here is the intensification of competition and violence among the cartels, and importantly, I think what we've seen at each stage is a greater brutality. The rules at each stage in the game become much less constraining for what constitutes acceptable levels or characteristics of violence. Hanging bodies from bridges, decapitations, mutilation of various forms that are frankly not subject for public discussion. This kind of violence, I think, is what has drawn our attention to this problem and raises some very real issues for judicial sector reform in Mexico. The thing that this volume does, I think, very well is to point us towards some of the good things that are happening on the ground and things that we can support and encourage. Dan has talked a little bit about police sector reform, and this is an area where enormous progress has been made, despite everything that we think about Mexican police. Mexican police are today better, more democratic, more professionalized than ever before. That's probably a surprising thing to say, but when recently, one of the things that we did separately from this project is a major survey of police in 6 different municipalities in Mexico, in the Guadalajara Metropolitan zone. And one of the things that you really see, we surveyed some 5,422 officers, about 80% of the force in the 6 municipalities that make up the Zona Metropolitan de Guadalajara. The results of this were published several months ago, six or 7 months ago. But in this survey, what you find is that the young recruits, the people that are coming into the police, are more educated and have a stronger professional orientation and a sort of more idealistic viewpoint about police corruption than people who've been on the force for long periods of time. And in several police departments where you're seeing the effort to purge old corrupt elements in the force, you're seeing real change when these new recruits come in. The problem is that when you ask them if they still see corruption on the force, easily 40 to 60% of them say that there are high levels, significantly high levels on a scale of, I think we use a scale of 1 to 4 or 1 to 5, 40 to 60% saying there's high level corruption on the force. And when you ask them where is corruption located on the force, it's at the very highest levels. 60% of them saying it is top level command in local police forces that we're seeing the problem. The solution to this problem, talking about municipal police from the federal government standpoint, is the idea of centralizing or unifying police forces at the state level, which is an idea based on the fundamental assumption that somehow there will be, you'll have an easier time of eliminating corruption at the state level, of making economies of scale at the state level. And so a presumption that somehow state level police forces are better or easier to control than local police forces, which is a very large and I think somewhat erroneous assumption. That said, it's probably a done deal, so might as well, it's kind of like the weather, might as well stop talking about it and start getting out the umbrellas. We have to think about what police unification is going to do at the state level and also what it's not going to do. What it's not going to do, in my view, in the short term, is increase the level of oversight and protections that are needed within a police department that will ensure professionalization. It's not just about giving them the right training or giving them guns and not making them go out and buy them on their own. It's about establishing procedures and mechanisms so that advancement on the force and promotions is fair and transparent. And when you ask police officers themselves about those procedures for professional advancement on the force, there's a consensus. 70% of the officers we surveyed say that there are no fair and transparent mechanisms for professional advancement in police. So until you establish that, I don't think we're going to see much change. The other area where we've seen some progress is actually with regard to criminal procedure and judicial reform. Mexico is experiencing a revolution in judicial reform similar to the one that we experienced back in the 60s. We like to think that we're so advanced and that we've always had a highly professionalized and confiable, trustworthy, thank you, police force and judicial sector apparatus in the United States. But when did we actually have universal due process protections in the United States? Did it start with Gideon versus Wainwright in 1963 when suddenly everyone did have a formal right to have a public defender and not have to pay out of their own pocket? Did it start when you had due process protections upon arrest in 1967 with the Miranda case? Or did it start when we finally began to investigate police corruption and prosecutorial misconduct in the 1970s with the Knapp Commission and the sort of of insider information from whistleblowers like Serpico. It's been a long road to develop this process of a fair and transparent criminal justice system like the one we think we have today in the United States. And I think Mexico has been, for the last 10 years, working very hard to try to make progress on that road. One of the most important advances I think that many people have pointed to is the 2008 criminal justice reforms, which we outline in the chapter on judicial reform. I don't have time to go into the details of this procedure or this change in criminal procedure, but suffice to say that they have tried to introduce new veto points and new mechanisms to promote transparency, efficiency, and fairness in the judicial system at different points, both in terms of monitoring the prosecution during the pretrial investigation phase and in terms of the presentation of evidence and argument in court, and even into the post-sentencing process as we've built in new mechanisms for adjudication and mediation of disputes. All of these things are wonderful. It comes down to implementation. Mexico has a federal level Consejo de Coordinación for implementation, a coordinating council. It struggled initially for the first couple of years. The first technical secretary unfortunately was killed in a plane crash that also took out Mexico's Minister of the Interior. The committee initially was not funded. There was no line item for funding in the budget, so they had to go beg for money from the Congress. There were a number of stumbling blocks at the beginning, but I think in the last year a very significant amount of progress has been made in developing an interagency process for coordination with among federal agencies and at the state level. A new criminal code was just introduced this fall, a federal criminal code which will set the guidelines for states. These are very critical and important steps forward in the judicial reforms. I am not optimistic, however, that we will see the 19 out of 32 federal entities move towards a new criminal system by 2012, as this administration would like to see, much less making all how many did I say? 32 states and federal entities fully implement the reforms by 2016, which is the mandate required by the 2008 judicial reforms. Right now, we have about I think at last count something like 8 or 9 states that have actually implemented the reforms that are in the process. The last one to go live was Baja California in August. We're seeing states very gradually move forward in the implementation process, but there are huge challenges, both in the short term, in terms of getting lawyers up to speed and training them in how to actually implement this system, converting the courtrooms, the basic infrastructure. It's very expensive. They spent something like $50 million just in the state of Chihuahua to get this online. So there are initial sort of startup challenges. There are also longer-term challenges in terms of monitoring and evaluating how the system's working and even winning over public opinion. There's a real danger, I think, that these reforms will fall victim to their own, to the image that they are too permissive, that the idea of the presumption of innocence is leading to 1,000 Willie Hortons running around in Mexico. Right? This problem of public perception of these reforms as being protective of criminals, which it's protective of suspects. Right? Not of criminals, but of suspects, is I think, a very problematic one. I'm not going to go into final comments partly because it's in Spanish and partly because I believe I'm out of time, but I will just say once again, I think that the major contribution of this volume is that it follows the spirit of collaboration that has, I think, begun to characterize the U.S.-Mexico relationship on security issues, and I hope will offer a contribution to sustaining that collaboration over the longer term. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. Let's turn quickly now to José Diaz-Briceño, I'm sorry. A longtime friend, actually, and also Washington, D.C. correspondent for the Reforma newspaper since 2005. He did not write this as part of his employment at the Reforma. He wrote this independently, but he's a very successful journalist as well. So thank you, Jose. Adelante.
Gracias, Eric. Thank you very much. First of all, I wanted to thank, like everyone else, Andrew, Eric, David, and all the staff at the Mexico Institute for inviting me to collaborate in this project. As Eric said, I'm a full-time correspondent for one of the largest newspapers in Mexico, so completing this project itself was a huge challenge for me, especially during this complex time of the Mexico-U.S. relationship. And before I proceed, I just wanted to make clear that any statement I make here is basically only my own and in no way represents an official position of the newspaper I work for.
and not NPR either, as far as I know.
But yes, so the main objective of the paper that I was in charge of was to take a glimpse into the U.S. domestic drug trade and its connections abroad. Since August of last year, when Andrew first approached me, it was clear that the best way to address the subject was to take a slice of the pie and focus my research on a few cities. Having visited Charlotte, North Carolina before talking to him to report on heroin overdoses over there, I decided to concentrate in one of the most interesting developments of the past few years, which is the arrival of what is known as Mexican black tar heroin to the eastern states of the Mississippi. Anyway, for those of you who are not familiar with black tar, this is an unrefined form of heroin similar to a Tootsie Roll that can be injected, snorted, or smoked. It's sold in little balloons of 80 milligrams per dose, and those doses cost between $8 and $12 each one of them. Anyway, despite few reliable data, we can say that up until the late 1990s, the U.S. domestic heroin market was clearly divided. Mexican black tar dominating the western half of the country, and Colombian white mostly dominating the east. There is some DEA hard data to support that even today, the major heroin markets in the East Coast, like Baltimore, New York, or D.C., continue to be supplied by Colombian heroin. Yet, some medium cities started to report sometime around 2005 and 2006 that a high-potency version of Mexican black tar was widely available. The news that Mexican black tar was hitting some markets east of the Mississippi really represented an historic move, breaking the dominance of the Colombian white since its arrival in the late 1980s. The point here was to discover what were the driving forces behind this move. And well, the first and usual questions that everybody asks would say something like, was this a testament to the long tentacles of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman? Was this a demonstration of the corrosive power of youth gangs like MS-13 in America? And well, after going back to Charlotte and also visiting Columbus, Ohio, what I found was a much more interesting picture. I found little of El Chapo. I found almost no gangs involved in trade and no noticeable violence, which runs contrary to many of the assumptions that we think are linked to drug trafficking, especially with Mexican syndicates. But anyway, before I continue, I just wanted to say that before coming here, I just pull out the numbers for GDP for Honduras and Guatemala, and also for these two cities, Columbus and Charlotte, and well, it's just striking. With a fraction of the population of these big countries, Columbus, for example, has an 89 billion GDP. Charlotte has a 118 billion GDP. Meanwhile, Guatemala has a 39 billion GDP. Honduras has a 13 billion GDP. So just analyzing two cities in the U.S. Means going into an economy that is highly complex and difficult to understand. But anyway, what were the main findings of the report? Basically, I can say that the overriding force behind the resurgence of heroin in these medium-sized cities is the growing abuse of prescription pain relievers since at least the year 2000. Just in 2008, in Ohio, abuse of artificial opioids like OxyContin and Vicodin were so high that they became the #1 reason for unintended deaths in the state, surpassing motor vehicle accidents for the first time in history. This large pool of people addicted to artificial opioids created a business opportunity for any creative entrepreneur who was able to bring a cheaper substance with the same narcotic effect. A second finding, the arrival of a cheap and potent version of Mexican black tar heroin into the eastern United States is directly linked to the business savviness of individual producers and brokers which have only scant contact with the large Mexican DTOs. Produced on the Mexican Pacific coast, notably in the Nayarit township of Jalisco, the movement of black tar heroin in Columbus and Charlotte of the past decade was the product of the work of several teams connected to a producer and broker back in Mexico. These teams would be comprised of, let's say, 5 runners plus a cell head, a mix of undocumented immigrants and U.S. citizens. Law enforcement in both cities think that, for example, in Charlotte there are at least 10 of these cells, and in Columbus at least 20. An important point in this discussion is that these cells need very small quantities of heroin to reach profitability. A very conservative assessment of the profits of one cell is 2.1 million per year. Obviously, some of it stays with the cell head, and something goes back to Mexico, which is a really difficult assessment to make. The heroin is trafficked from Nayarit all the way through trusted intermediaries in private cars through the California and Arizona border, especially Los Angeles and Tucson, where it is shipped everywhere in the nation. Anyway, a third finding is that these heroin brokers, producers in Nayarit and their cells had mastered replicating in the eastern United States a successful business model that had been tried already in the West Coast. In contrast to large Mexican DTOs, long considered polydrug organizations, these brokers, producers deal only in heroin, which is the product they control from the farm in Jalisco. Trafficking cells in these cities had adapted themselves by catering directly to suburban consumers hooked already in artificial opiates. By deploying an efficient Domino's Pizza style business model in middle and upper class neighborhoods in both cities, these cells were able to reverse heroin's 1970s reputation as an inner city drug synonymous of dark alleys. More interestingly is that violence is not a prominent feature of these cells. A fourth finding is that since the arrival of the Nayarit cells, local law enforcement, both in Charlotte and Columbus, had adapted their investigative capacities towards focusing in organizations coming from the southwest border. After decades of having been supplied from larger hubs in the east, like Detroit or New York, both cities have become now regional hubs in the distribution of Mexican black tar. DEA has been the leading agency, sharing best practices and experience in helping local authorities understand the operation of the Nayarit cells. Despite two recent arrests of heroin traffickers from Sinaloa and Michoacán, it still remains to be seen some enforcement on the Mexican side in Jalisco specifically. Nevertheless, other priorities reign supreme, with cocaine being the main threat guiding the cartels. I just want to point out some questions, some lingering questions coming out of these findings. The spirit of a reporter, rather than recommending policy options, is thinking of questions, what to ask. And anyway, the first one is, in the coming years, it would be very interesting to see whether the Nayarit cells are able to adapt themselves and break into the major heroin markets in the Northeast, like New York, Baltimore, Washington. Let's see if they can adapt their suburban business model and go beyond medium-sized cities. A second question that it's interesting to me is that at the same time that they were seeing a widespread availability of heroin in many markets in the U.S., U.S. authorities were already making estimates of how production in Mexico skyrocketed in the past few years. And this is a little bit paradoxical because, these are the years of the strongest and most devoted fight against the drug cartels, as the government says. And at the same time, the U.S. estimating, for example, that heroin production in Mexico skyrocketed from 18 metric tons in 2007 to 38 metric tons in 2008. So it's a huge leap, and this poses a question about how eradication efforts in Mexico are going. And obviously, the National Drug Control Strategy ventured a hypothesis saying that because of the military devoted to public security efforts in the cities and the border, they have basically disregarded eradication efforts, not only of heroin, but also marijuana. And a third question that I have after reading many literature of Nayarit newspapers. I was not able to go to Nayarit, I just stayed in the U.S. But reading local press, it's interesting that violence in Jalisco specifically has started to rise. But most interestingly is that there seems to be violence, at least from some anecdotal reports, of bad deals in the U.S. that basically are, are being taken revenge upon in Mexico, specifically in Jalisco. This would be an interesting topic of discussion of how much of the violence in several regions in Mexico has to deal with U.S. deals that gone bad. And anyway, basically, and another interesting point that would be interesting to explore would be how the cartels would be interested in taking control of these small organizations. Probably if revenues continue to be scarce because of pressures on cocaine and so on, they would probably have less tolerance on leaving these independent brokers pass through their border plazas. And, well, I just wanted to thank also all the people that helped me in my research, law enforcement officials in both cities and some specialist treatment and also some addicts. And I just wanted to end with the idea that basically we need to have more and more studies directed to domestic drug trafficking in the U.S., because when talking about violence in Mexico, we're just looking at half of the story. And well, with that, I finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jose. We have a little bit of time here for questions before we wrap up. Miguel has a microphone here. Dana on that side. Please We'll follow the same procedure, 3 questions, identify yourself, and then we'll take some answers quickly right here.
Yes, I'm Dennis Gilbert, Hamilton College. Picking up on Jose's last comment there, how much does official corruption on this side of the border play into the drug trade? We had some arrests a few weeks back of border agents, and I just wonder, beyond that, what can you say about this?
Great. There was a question all the way in the back.
Hi, Sam Logan again with Southern Pulse. Question for Steve. I have a lot of questions for you, Steve, but I'll keep it limited to just this one. When you talk about the narcomenudeo in Central America, I was wondering if you'd be willing to comment on what you found specifically with the drugs that are being sold on the street corners in San Salvador or in Managua. Are we talking about specifically cocaine? Are we talking about perhaps crack cocaine, which could be a high-volume, low-price option for people who have less money? And then maybe if I could just sneak in an additional, if you will, Eric. As the Colombians have retreated south and the Mexicans have advanced, why haven't we seen more violence between those groups?
And then the last question over here with Dolia. Oh, sorry. We'll come back. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to ask particularly David about this new term that we are increasingly seeing, not only in the academia, but in the official talk in Washington, starting with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, about describing the violence in Mexico, the organized crime violence in Mexico as an insurgency, and terrorism. Initially, it was said that she misspoke, but then she misspoke again last week. So it is just not credible at this point that she's misspeaking, someone with her experience, so often. And there's also a number of studies linked to the Pentagon that reiterate this new diagnóstico, if you want to call it. And I was just wondering if you have any comment on that.
Great. Why don't we take some responses here? Steve, you want to start, or do you want to start?
Just a quick
Go ahead.
thing on corruption. I encourage you to take a look at an earlier hearing in the Homeland Security Committee in the Senate it was conducted by Senator Mac Pryor from Arkansas about corruption of U.S. agents, specifically at the border, CBP, ICE personnel, and also some local officials. And after that hearing, Senator Pryor presented a bill to strengthen the internal controls of the Border Patrol and other agencies to, prevent them to be penetrated by the cartels themselves. Obviously, it's a bill that is moving very, very slowly.
Steve?
Thanks for the question, Sam. The first question has to do with the narcomenudeo in San Salvador and Managua. Actually, I didn't do much very specific research on that topic, unfortunately, and it is a topic I would encourage anyone who wants to really dig into, because I think this is one of these things we're going to be seeing in the very near future, and what they're seeing already on the ground is this is just sort of impact at the smallest levels. Just thinking about the healthcare industry of countries like Guatemala and Honduras with these very teeny GDPs. How are they going to handle the health crisis that comes with this massive increase in consumption? As far as the drugs themselves go, the notion is, and again, I didn't get down to the ground level to look at this, but the notion is that they're getting paid in the powder, because the powder, the HCl, is what's leaving the laboratories. There aren't many laboratories of HCl in Central America, if any, and what they're being paid in is the powder that's being processed. Actually, the coca leaves being processed in these countries of production. Mostly Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia, and then that's what's moving north. So that's actually what's transacted. What they do with that is a very interesting question, and I think it would be a very interesting line of investigation, because obviously the more you break that down, the more derivatives you can have of that, then the greater your profit margin. So I would imagine that there is also sort of a sub-laboratory culture that may be emerging in some of these places where they're breaking it down further and further to garner more profit, and that would be your crack cocaine or derivatives thereof. That would be my best estimation of the problem, looking at it from 10,000 feet, but I would encourage people to go down to the ground, and Sam, I know you will be one of them. The other question about Mexican and Colombian groups, I think that was directed at me, I'm not sure. Why is there not more violence between them? Well, I'm not really sure they have, they're competing over the same territories. There may have been, and we just didn't see it, there may have been a period of violence in some of these intermediary territories, some of these transit zones, like in Central America, that we just didn't see. There's a lot of things that happen that we just don't see. But the reaccommodation of territory is such that they're not in that direct competition. I think that you are seeing bits of it. For example, a couple months ago, I noticed a case in Bolivia, and it had to do with a major. This is a weird case because it was a major Paraguayan national who was operating in Bolivia, who was working with Serbians and Colombians, and who was attacked by a mishmash of groups, which they don't know yet, may have included Mexicans, and he was kidnapped. And that is over control of what appears to be control over the market at its very base source. It's something that Doug Farrell was talking about. Getting access to the HCl right where it's processed. If you can get that, then you can control the entire chain of distribution. So I think maybe if we think about Colombia, we think that those are pretty established points of process, and that they have established rings of security, and that they have established means of getting out their product. So there's not going to be that much instability aside from between those Colombian groups. And that if you think about maybe looking at some of the other places in the region where there might be more of a battle over these HCl sources, you might see maybe an uptick in violence like that. I mean, this guy was kidnapped. He hasn't been heard from since. His Serbian, what they called bodyguards, were killed, and it just remains a big mystery. And that opens up a whole another series of questions of again, what Doug Farrell was talking about, the increasing presence of Eastern Europeans. He talked about Russians. I would make more reference to Serbians, but nonetheless, the sort of connections are there.
Great. David, did you want to add anything?
Sure. Just on the I word. In terms of, is this a new shift in academic or official discourse, I think it's important to keep in mind that the greatest analytical challenge is defining our concepts, right? Because once you define your concept, that's what determines how you measure the problem, and then the measurements you use determines how you evaluate change or explain the problem. And then once you've figured out some kind of causal explanation, that sets your prescriptions for solving the problem. I think in some ways the movement to use the insurgency language goes in the reverse order, trying to identify a useful prescription and then sort of work backward towards what are seen as a set of problems. And I think there are some advantages and disadvantages to that. On the one hand, I mean, when we look at what we're seeing in Mexico, when you see political assassinations, there have been 25 or so mayors assassinated in the last couple, certainly 20 in the last year, or in the last, 20 to 25 since 2005. Prior to 2005, from say 1995 to 2005, how many mayors were assassinated in Mexico? As far as I can tell from the searching that we've done, the number is 0. That's a huge shift, a significant shift in the sort of political dynamics of violence. Car bombs, paramilitary organizations like the Zetas, public information campaigns to terrorize citizens and elected officials, anti-government discourse in places like Michoacan, where Felipe Calderón is viewed as an occupier. That does look awfully different than just a bunch of profit-making criminal organizations. But the question is the ultimate goal, as we understand it in political science, is the ultimate goal of these organizations to topple and replace or supplant the Mexican state. And I think that that's where academics are going to resist this idea of an insurgency as long as possible, because it's not how we would want to characterize it from a technical point of view, comparing it to, say, a civil war, a conflict in say, Sudan or somewhere like that, where you have actual groups that are either trying to separate from or supplant the state. I think that the strong desire to use the insurgency framework comes from in part from the fact that we have an actual manual for solving the insurgency problem. You can see we're using that in other parts of the world, that manual. It's sort of like, we've talked about the Pentagon's new map. It's the Pentagon's new hammer, if you will. It's a new tool for thinking about dealing with problems around the world. It's about winning hearts, and it's a model that emphasizes winning hearts and minds, economic and social development programs, and in that sense, it may actually have some validity as a tool. It may actually achieve some results if we think about this problem as systemic, at its systemic root level. But then, what do we call the Crips and the Bloods? Do we have do we have an insurgency, a criminal insurgency in North American cities? And should we send in the military? I think part of the problem of this Pentagon's new hammer is that it's really not clear when and how it should be used. And I think before we start thinking about this problem as an insurgency, we really need to understand the problem as a little bit more complex than that discourse leads us to believe. And it's also, I think, problematic because it problematizes our relationship with Mexico. It makes it more difficult for us to work with Mexico when we use this insurgency language, because it suggests that Mexico is, as some people have described it, a failed state. Well, what about Brazil? What about Colombia? What about many of these countries in Central America that, in fact, are experiencing far worse violence? And are we going to treat the whole hemisphere as an insurgency? I don't think we can realistically do that, and I don't think it's ultimately an accurate characterization of the problem. So, thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to use the heavy hand of the chair and allow for one more question that was over here, and then we're going to wrap up.
Thank you. Inigo Guevara, Mexican writer. This question is for Mr. Dudley. You seem to have focused your research on Honduras, and I'd like to know is there a particular Mexican cartel operating in Central America, or could you expand on that? Thank you.
In my research, I found two major cartels working in Central America, and again, I focused on the Northern Triangle, so I visited El Salvador. I was in Honduras the most because I was there a couple times last year after the, I don't know what to call it anymore, coup,
the coup,
overthrow, pajama party. I like that one. That's the best one yet. And I also went to Guatemala. I used to live in Guatemala before, but way back when, so I saw some major changes between the time I lived there and the time I went there. The cartels I saw were the Zetas, with a huge presence, and really as much a presence, a physical presence. I saw them. I went to Coban, which is Alta Verapaz, which is north of Guatemala City. And that's one of their major headquarters, and literally you could see them driving around the backs of pickup trucks with AR-15s and all the rest. So there's a bit of a physical presence. But there's also a presence. The Zetas are, and Sam knows a lot about this because he's writing a book on it. But the Zetas are amazing. They have this amazing mythical presence. And so it's as much a presence in terms of physical presence and their presence in the operations and possibly taking over some of the corridors as it is this kind of notion of, oh my God, the Zetas are here. And that's what you feel in Guatemala. And the truth of the matter is there's another major cartel in operation there that has worked there for a lot longer, which is the Sinaloa Cartel. And they control some of the major areas of transit, in particular the area along the border with Mexico, the southern border which is most important to them because they traffic most of their cocaine via the Pacific Ocean and via that Pacific coast. And so they operate in Huehuetenango and San Marcos, and they have all the connections there, and they operate in a different way from the Zetas. They don't come in guns blazing, top-down structure, you must do whatever we say, we're going to bring in our own people, etc. They integrate themselves much more closely to the communities in which they work. So we're talking about throwing big parties. We're talking about the old Escobar model of pulling out washing machines during Christmas, and handing them out to people. So there's a different MO as well, which may, in the end, we'll have to see, but in the end seems to be, at least in the case of Huehuetenango, I found, seemed to be giving them an edge over the more military, hierarchical, structure-minded Zetas. They worked with the locals. They, gave money out to, so you could get your teeth fixed. Whatever it was. The other in Honduras, it's a little bit more sketchy. But again, when you start to dig a little bit deeper, what you hear about is the Zetas. When you start to dig a little bit deeper, you find Sinaloa. And that's kind of the pattern that you see. What you hear about is the Zetas. When you dig deeper, you find Sinaloa. And the way that Sinaloa operates as well in terms of their ability to penetrate the state, certainly there is a lot of allusions to that in Mexico and some of its reality and some of it's not so much. But that same way that they operate in Mexico, their ability to penetrate all levels of the state. We're talking about the judicial structures. We're talking about the police structures. We're talking about, just all the different ways in which they can penetrate those things. You see that and feel that in those countries in Central America. So those are the two major cartels that are operating there.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there were just a few points I wanted to draw out here. As we did this research, I think one of the key ones is these are not static organizations. They're always evolving and changing shape and changing their strategies. There isn't so much vertical integration amongst them the way in a classic sort of monopoly or cartel way, but that there's a lot of this horizontal integration, as Steve was alluding to here. I think the things that we need to keep looking at as researchers and academics is the importance of these borders and crossing the borders. As enforcement focuses on borders and it becomes difficult to get across the borders, be it Guatemala, Mexico, Mexico and the United States, organized crime seems to take on a more important and significant role as they have the power and the wherewithal to try to challenge the state crossing those borders. There's a lot here that we haven't touched on. The question of why is violence so great in Mexico and Central America and not such a big problem in the United States is one that we all continue to wrestle with, and so I think we'll continue this process of learning and researching and hopefully helping inform the public on this. Thank you all again for staying with us. Just two announcements. Somebody has left their cell phone downstairs at the guard shack or something. So if you're missing a cell phone, please check with them on your way out. Secondly, and I'm not sure Dolia made this announcement or not, we have an event coming up on November 9th or 8th. Did you make this announcement? Just a real fascinating opportunity to hear from the Committee to Protect Journalists about their report on violence against journalists. You're welcome back. It's at 1:30 on November 9th. 8th, I keep saying it wrong, excuse me. 1:30 on November 8th, and so welcome. Thank you all very much.